Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, desolate stars, peasants, vassals, Shiites, Sunnis, Syrians, terrorists, Syrians. I'm East Lydia, and today I want to talk about, obviously, the Israeli airstrikes in Syria. And, of course, this is the big story, and we've been leading up to this for some time. And, in fact, oddly enough, there were reports of an Israeli strike a week ago, and I did a video on that, and I felt like even though it was unconfirmed, it still seems likely that it happened. And there's a simple fact for explaining why this would be. On certain occasions, neither side would acknowledge, because if neither side acknowledges it, then neither one is required to respond or retaliate, and then both sides can save face. But that said, it's still rather coincidental and interesting that I did a video a week ago about a purported Israeli strike outside of Damascus, and then this same scenario unfolds this last weekend with much the same targets. So that's rather peculiar. But that said, as I also promised back in January when there were Israeli jet strikes inside Syria, there would be a lot more strikes coming, and certainly there has been. And this is a good example of that. Although there is some debate as to whether all or some of these attacks were done with by Israeli jet fighters or by missiles launched from somewhere else. But there were reports of 16 Israeli jets flying over Lebanese airspace, although the connection to these attacks is not clear. Now, the Israelis claim that they were going after Fatah 110 missiles that were being shipped through Syria by Iran to get to Hezbollah. And that was the main justification, is that they wanted to make sure these kind of sophisticated weapons don't fall into the hands of Hezbollah. And I have a problem with that scenario for a couple of reasons. One is the fact that knowing that it's a Syrian war zone, it doesn't necessarily make sense that Iran would be shipping weapons systems on a massive scale through Syria to get to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And I also question it because of the fact that Syria and Iran have been capable of giving all kinds of weapons to Hezbollah for a decade at least, if not 2 decades, and they've had free access to most of the sophisticated weaponry, and Syria and Iran had not been giving to them. I don't necessarily know why now would be the time that Iran and Syria would want to arm the Hezbollah more heavily. And so anyway, there's a number of issues with this whole scenario. But the other thing about this is that not only did they attack these missiles that were outside of the Damascus International Airport on Friday, but by the time Israeli jets struck Saturday, Sunday, they hit bases of the Syrian elite Republican Guard. In fact, there's reports of 100 Syrian soldiers being killed, so this is a substantial attack. And then the storehouses of these long-range missiles, these Fatah 110 missiles, and then a military research center, which U.S. sources say was a chemical weapons production plant. So the military research center, of course, is right in line with the supposed attack from last weekend, which is interesting. And then the fact that they say that these Fatah 110 missiles were in storehouses guarded by elite Republican Guard would suggest that maybe they were there for Syria, because Syria does have a war going on. That's another thing I have a question about. Why would necessarily Syria be stepping up arms shipments, or Iran stepping up arms shipments to Hezbollah? It would seem that the Syrian regime would need all the weapons they have right now. Although figures have come out that suggest that the opposition forces only number 30,000, and that number is dwindling. And I remind you that Syria has an army of 740,000, and as well as an air force that they haven't used that much yet. So So anyway, that said, let's get into some of the details here. So yeah, there's 100 Syrian soldiers killed, multiple sites bombed, including a massive piece of ordnance that was dropped in one place with a shock and awe mushroom cloud. Two spokesmen for Netanyahu, or a spokesman for Netanyahu, said Israel is trying to avoid, quote, escalating tension to Syria, unquote. Well, they have an interesting way to go about that, but that's kind of an Israeli method of trying to avoid escalating tension is by escalating tension. Reverse psychology, I suppose. And then a lot of news reports are suggesting this is a message to Iran, not Syria. That said, it's still an incursion into sovereign Syrian airspace in the middle of a war. So it is, regardless if it's a message to Iran, it's a very provocative act inside Syria. And I still don't really understand why Hezbollah would want another war with Israel at this point either. That doesn't make sense. In fact, Hezbollah has its hands full because they're protecting Lebanese villages that are within the borders of Syria. So they're involved in the conflict of Syria, and they need to have their weapons for their involvement in Syria. And Hezbollah hasn't commented on this attack, which is interesting. It seems like they want to stay out of this right now. That would be how I would read it. But there's some other interesting little tidbits here, too. Israeli officials contacted the Prime Minister's office, military command, and defense, and foreign ministers refused to discuss the strikes on Sunday, strictly following a protocol designed to give adversaries face-saving room to avoid a response. So that's what I'm talking about, is where a lot of times these attacks, who can forget the Israeli strike on a Syrian nuclear plant about 10 years ago or so, and nothing was ever done about it, because that way both of them need not confront each other and get in an untenable situation. And certainly both parties have a lot of reason to do that here. And Danny Denon, the Deputy Defense Minister of Israel, said that, quote, the state of Israel is protecting its interests and will continue doing so. Quote, we will do everything anywhere in order to protect those interests, unquote. And they've certainly proven that over and over again. And I think they're also sending a message to Obama that when Israel said there's a red line, they will do something about it, prodding Obama to follow through on his promises. And now there's the inevitable U.S. calls for airstrikes now that they've seen that the Syrian air defense is not what it's supposed to be, and Israel has opened the door. That would probably be the next logical step, because this is coincidental. I have to imagine it's not coincidental, actually, that these Israeli strikes come at a time when the opposition in Syria is on its back, and the Syrian army is making a lot of aggressive, offensive, and victorious moves in the field, and they are countering this opposition. And that is not what the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel are interested in. So they will have to take a step and move more drastically. And that's what's going on now. I guess this option was already debated in secret by the United States, Britain, and France in the days leading to the Israeli strikes. And, of course, John McCain is in the front. He wants to get right in there. And as I often say, John McCain obviously learned nothing when he was in Vietnam. And then we also have this Ayal Zisser, an expert on Syria and Lebanon at Tel Aviv University, and he came out and said, quote, this is the kind of thing you know how it begins, but not how it ends, unquote. I certainly agree with that, but he goes on to say, quote, Israel is still not involved in the war in Syria, unquote. Well, I have to disagree. They are involved in the civil war, and they say that this is a message to Iran, but it's a message to Syria. It's a message to Syria that no matter what happens, no matter how many victories they have in the field against the opposition, they will lose in the end, because intervention is inevitable in one form or another. And I also think it's interesting that, as I brought up in my previous videos about Israeli airstrikes and why I predicted there would be more, because Israel can act with impunity, and they're certainly kicking Assad while he's down and taking advantage of this opportunity. Even though they said they're done for now, I have to predict that there will be more Israeli airstrikes, and things will continue to escalate. And incidentally, there's also a new UN report that verifies something I brought up in my videos, and those in the know are well aware of, and that's the UN experts have now confirmed that there has been sarin gas and limited use of chemical weapons inside Syria, but it was the opposition who were using it, just as we suspected, because there really is no reason for the Assad regime to use chemical weapons in the field, and he's gone out of his way to protect them. So there we have it. We have the strikes that send a clear message to Iran. Hezbollah, I suppose, is the angle given in the press. But what we really have is Israel waging a private proxy war inside Syria for its own interests, taking out elite units, chemical weapons plants, missiles, all the ordnance that could potentially fall into someone else's hands should the Assad regime fall. So there's a lot of complex elements in this Syrian conflict, aside from the civil war and all the foreign interventionists and the jihadists and all the special operations agents and all the gun running and everything else. And that is the complexity of knowing that most of your opposition is radical jihadists and wanting the Assad regime to topple, but at the same time wanting to control his vast stockpile of weapons. And good luck with that. So there we have it. More Israeli airstrikes inside Syria. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.